Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos over on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Today I'm back with another very exciting video, and this video again is sponsored by Now TV. So Now TV is a leading streaming service here in the UK where you can watch all sorts of content. They literally have so much on there, from TV shows to movies to sports to loads. So if you haven't already started checking out Now TV, then I definitely recommend it because there's a lot of content on there to keep everyone happy. The reason that this video in particular is in collaboration with Now TV is because there is a new documentary that you can watch over on Now TV using the entertainment pass. Obviously I'll have all the details and the links to that down below. Also very exciting is that there is a new Sky crime channel, if you didn't already know, which is kind of like Sky's own home for all things true crime related, so that's obviously perfect for you guys. I'm sure if you're watching this channel then you are definitely interested in that, so that's also definitely worth a watch, which again you can watch content from there through the Now TV entertainment pass. The documentary relating to today's video is called KEMPER on KEMPER: Inside the Mind of a Serial Killer. And it is fascinating. It's a very well done documentary that kind of not only looks into the crimes of a serial killer, so if you are a fan of watching things relating to serial killers you'll definitely enjoy this, but it is also very different because it shows kind of the aftermath and how much this individual had impacted behavioural science and forensic investigations unit following his crimes. It's very fascinating. So like I said, if you want to check out the entertainment pass and Now TV and everything like the documentary, the link and all the information you'll need will be in the description below. But for today's video, I'm basically going to be focusing on Edmund Kemper, the serial killer that is kind of featured in this documentary. I'm going to talk you through his early life, his crimes, and also what happened after he was caught and everything like that. So I know there are a lot of you guys who do enjoy serial killer related videos, so hopefully this is one for you. So if you want to hear a little bit about Edmund Kemper, the serial killer known as the co-ed killer, then keep on watching and we suggest get started. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December the 18th in the year of 1948 in a place called Burbank in California. His biological parents were named Clarnell and Edmund Kemper Jr., and he had a particularly interesting childhood, I guess, to say the least. When Edmund had been just 9 years old, his parents decided to officially separate from their marriage. They decided to take a break. Their marriage was quite an unstable one. It wasn't very secure at all. And then they had officially separated before officially divorcing when he was 13 years old. From quite an early age, he'd shown signs of a particularly high IQ. He was seen as being a very intelligent child from a very young age, but he also, in retrospect, had shown some rather disturbing behaviours, which now we know, if we spot, they are kind of warning signs for psychopathy and for some quite dangerous, potentially dangerous individuals and behaviours, but at the time it wasn't really known or thought of as anything concerning, really. So these behaviours included using his sister's dolls as a means of acting out strange rituals, as well as having been found torturing and killing animals. His relationship with his mother in particular was a strenuous one, as she was very harsh and abusive towards him. She was known to be very verbally abusive. She was quite overbearing and tormenting, and they just really did not have a very good relationship whatsoever. Kemper was believed to have been on the receiving end of years of humiliation and embarrassment at the hands of his mother, and it was later considered the possibility of her having suffered from some form of personality disorder maybe, or something that was undiagnosed that would explain her extreme emotional outbursts and pure anger towards her son, while others have just argued that they just did not have a very healthy relationship at all. And pretty much the pair would just constantly argue, and they would have very extreme arguments, and she would tell him over and over again that he was worthless and he would never really amount to anything, and he had this for many years of his life. There had been a period of his young life where he was actually confined to the basement in his family home at the hands of his mother, who had been concerned that if she'd left him roaming free in the house, then he would harass or molest his two sisters. He had been living in this house surrounded by these three quite dominant women who would belittle him, and the only really male figureheads that he had in his life were his stepfathers that he would get to know and almost kind of attach himself to very briefly before they would then leave for whatever reason. But his mother was she'd worked her way through a couple of different men, and so he didn't really have a lot of solid male role models in his life, but he had these 3 dominant women. But in defence of his family, it is often noted in a number of sources that Edmund's family were very heavily involved in his life. Whether he had a successful relationship with them or not is another question, but they were very heavily involved in his life, more so than a lot of other parents of children his age. But he was himself quite a hard to manage young boy. From a very young age, Edmund had this constant fear of people and boys his own age humiliating him or hurting him, to the point where he was never really able to make any form of connection with anyone his own age or near his own age. So he really just couldn't be around his own peers. And for many years it seemed as though his development in a number of senses was just completely stunted, all stemming back to his feelings towards his parents' divorce when he was young. From a concerningly young age, he had appeared to have a number of rather extreme fantasies that would either be violent or sexual in nature, or usually a combination of both, as well as displaying these unsettling behaviours that I'd said, like killing these animals and torturing his sister's dolls and things like that. In his early teens, he became much too hard for his mother to manage by herself, and Edmund had specifically asked her if he could move to LA, where he would live with his father and his father's new wife. But this situation didn't last very long at all, simply because just as his mother had experienced when Edmund's father and stepmother kind of got to know him and saw that he was quite a difficult child, they were at their wits' end just as much as the mother was, and they found it really difficult to live with him as well, because they just didn't really know how to handle him. And then things in Edmund's life took a change completely at the end of 1963 during the Christmas holiday season. He was just 15 years old at the time, and he was sent to stay with his paternal grandparents, so his grandmother and grandfather on his father's side, on their large farm in a place called North Fork in California. And initially it obviously seemed as though it was a temporary move, but it seemed as though it was just becoming more and more permanent as the holidays were over and Edmund remained there, and they even started school in the area. So when he began attending this local school, he really made very little impression on his peers and teachers, and all of the teachers that did recall him just kind of recalled him as being very, very quiet. Despite the fact that he showed signs from a very young age of having a very, very high IQ, his grades throughout school remained completely average, and he just seemed like an unremarkable student. But the one thing that did draw a significant amount of attention was his size. For years now, he had been showing signs of growing at a particularly accelerated rate, and by that point, so when he was 15, he was already much larger, much taller than any boys his age. So I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe by this point he was already about maybe 6 foot something, and he would just continue to grow from there, so he was very, very tall. His relationships with his grandparents that he had been living with were also far from perfect, likely due to the fact that he was a difficult child. However, it is also considered his relationship with his grandparents was far from perfect, although this is likely due to the fact that he does seem as though he was a kind of very difficult child in itself. However, it was a much better situation than what he had been experiencing when he was living with his mother and his sisters. Edmund and his grandfather in particular were very, very close, to the point where he'd even given him a .22 caliber rifle so that Edmund can go out and use it regularly for hunting in the area, since they lived on a farm. And it actually turned out to be a very, very effective outlet for all of his pent-up aggression. In the summer months of the year of 1984, when the school year had ended, Edmund had returned back to his mother's house, only to then be sent back to his grandparents just a few weeks later. So his grandmother, her name was Maud, she had immediately made it known that she believed Edmund's behaviour had regressed significantly since he had come back from being at his mother's house. Even though he was only there for a very short period of time, she said that his behaviour had changed and regressed so clearly, so significantly, that it was like he had never made any progress since being at the farm, because she said that his behaviour, he was doing really well in school, he was behaving a lot better, but this changed completely, and it was almost as though he had never made any improvements just from the short trip home. And it was around this point that it seemed as though all of his violent, dark sexual fantasies began to return. And this time the fantasy specifically featured his grandmother, usually involving him ending her life using a gun in a particularly aggressive manner. Whenever he was out and about on the huge farmland property that his grandparents owned, he would often line up Maud while she was kind of just moving about doing jobs and things on the farm. He would hold up his rifle and kind of look at her through the eye line of the rifle to give himself the feeling of power as though he was about to end her life. Obviously, she would be completely unaware of this, but this was just like a little game that he played to himself that he just found that he was enjoying. Maud was said to have become quite wary of Edmund's change in behaviour and seemed as though she was growingly fearful of him. Not openly fearful, but just increasingly fearful. She'd allegedly taken her husband's pistol out of the house where possible, purely out of concern that it would fall into Edmund's hands. And then on August the 27th of 1964, all of the tension in the house came to a head. Edmund had been sat at the kitchen table with Maud while she was looking over some of the work she was doing. I think she was writing a children's book or something, when suddenly she'd looked up from her work and she'd seen Edmund just staring at her really, really intensely and intently, and it made her feel quite uncomfortable to the point where she asked him to stop. Very soon he stood up, he headed out with his rifle, called for the dog, and said that he was going out hunting. Maud simply replied to him, telling him not to shoot any birds because she didn't like that, before then focusing back fully on the work that was on the table. As Edmund left the house, he turned back to see the back of Maud sat at the kitchen table through the screen door to the kitchen, so he turned back round and all he could see was Maud from behind. He simply lifted his rifle, aimed it at the back of her head and fired a single shot. This shot had been fatal, but he decided to walk back into the kitchen and fire 2 more shots into her back. He walked back round the kitchen, wrapped a towel around her head and dragged her body into his grandparents' bedroom. Just a few minutes passed before his grandfather, KEMPER Sr., had returned home from food shopping when Edmund had also shot him in the back of the head while he was unloading the truck. In the documentary, it said that KEMPER claimed his main motive for killing his grandfather, a man who he had been very close with and had actually loved, had been simply because he cared too deeply for him to want to put him through the pain of seeing his wife dead. So he said he did it as an act of mercy. From this point on, Edmund had known that there wasn't any way that he could have escaped the blame for this. It wasn't a likely scenario for his grandparents to suddenly just up and leave their farm and their grandson and take a last-minute trip, and so he decided that it would kind of be a pointless effort for him to try and hide the remains and cover everything up. Instead, he simply rang his mother, telling him what happened, who in turn told him to ring the local sheriff. This is exactly what happened, and upon being taken in for questioning, he immediately confessed to murdering both of his grandparents, his grandmother being one that he claimed he had fantasised about for quite a while his grandfather's murder had been one out of an act of mercy. Because of Edmund's age, he was held in juvenile hall while his fate was decided for him, which is when a psychiatrist assigned to Edmund's case declared that he was both paranoid and psychotic. As a result of this formal hypothesis, he was committed to Atascadero State Hospital in December of 1964, aged just 15 years old. Now, this was no joke of a place. He was held here where there were some very, very serious and very, very mentally unwell, like criminally insane individuals. While he was held in this secure facility, it meant that he would undergo very extensive treatment and tests for officials to not only try and understand his crime, but to also try and understand why other similar offenders do what they do. He had refused throughout initially to take responsibility for the crimes he had committed by commonly stating that everything had been kind of out of his control. Before long, he had appeared to have improved significantly, and he was kind of just like a model patient, one who seemed to be putting his impressive intelligence to good use by aiding in laboratory research that was being carried out and kind of helping to administer psychological tests. But all of this was actually just his way of gaining knowledge of the system and what the officials and what the professionals would need to hear in order to see him as sane or see him as mentally sound, cured or whatever. It was all just kind of like a learning curve for him because he was learning how everything worked. During his stay at Atascadero, he had been diagnosed as a sociopath, but these behaviours of being like cooperative and eager to help that he was displaying during this kind of research contradicts this diagnosis entirely, leading professionals to have believed that there was a lot more improvement and development during his stay there than there actually had been. While being a patient in this facility, he had also come into regular contact, like I said, with some criminally insane offenders. So he'd gotten to know a lot of concerning individuals, including a number of repeat offenders like serial rapists and very, very violent individuals. And these people had obviously shared with him the details of each of their crimes, and not only was he able to kind of expand his fantasies, so these dark thoughts that he was already having, he was able to expand them even further because of hearing these stories, but he was also able to hear where each of these offenders went wrong in their crimes, what got them caught, where they made mistakes, what they would do differently. All of this again was just fueled his high intelligence to build his repertoire of knowledge of how to be a criminal. He had noted specifically that the main mistake of many of the offenders that they had made during their attacks, specifically sexual attacks, had been that they had either attacked someone that they were directly linked with, so there was some sort of relation there in some way, or they had attacked them in a public place, which left the possibility of witnesses. He was an extremely intelligent young man who was able to store all of these stories away in his head, and like I said, to build them on his fantasies and later help him carry out all of these disgusting crimes as a way of acting out his fantasies, while also being able to maintain the image to professionals in the facility to give them the impression that he had made incredible strides in his development. And then in the year of 1969, Edmund Kemper was released to the public. Soon after his release, he was pretty much sent straight back living with his mother. He was held under supervision for a short period following his release, just could still handle being in public. But he went back to living in this potentially toxic environment with his mother. And virtually immediately, the pair had begun to clash just as much as they had done before. One thing that was extremely prominent was that she had consistently told him that he had very low IQ, so he was very, very stupid, he had low intelligence, constantly over and over again, as well as the fact that he would never be good enough to get any girlfriends. He would never be able to get any sort of girl's interest, so the fact that he was dumb and he'd never get any girlfriends, this was just pounded into him, drilled into his head constantly over and over again by his mother. Around the area that the pair were living, it was known as quite a relaxed and party-orientated area, I guess, in some ways, because it was particularly close to UC Santa Cruz, where a number of students were pretty much always present. And it was particularly common in the area for people, particularly the young students at the university, to hitchhike around wherever they needed to go. It was just kind of like a common thing that happened in the area a lot. And this just became the perfect opportunity for Kemper to just be in close contact with all of these young girls that he had always never had the opportunity to be with since he had been incarcerated from such a young age. He'd never really had the opportunity to come into contact with girls, meaning that he'd never really had the opportunity to understand all of these sorts of pretty young girls that his mother told him would never ever be interested in him and that he would never be good enough for. At first, he would simply give these female hitchhikers rides to wherever they were going so he could understand how they would act around him and how he could gain their trust and how he could get them talking to him, but also to train himself to see what extent he could control his own fantasies. All the while, his violent fantasies would be continuing in his head, but now they involved specifically each of these female hitchhikers. And this went on for months as a regular occurrence, but then on May the 7th in the year of 1972, things changed completely. Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Lucchesa were two young female students who had been trying to hitchhike to Stanford University. The pair had been picked up by Edmund, who proceeded to drive them around for a little bit, but before long he pulled out his gun, which had been hidden under his seat in his car, and threatened them while he drove them to a secluded area. He forced Anita to get into the boot of his car while threatening her at gunpoint, while Mary Ann remained in the back seat. Once Anita was inside the boot, he returned to Mary Ann and attempted to suffocate her using a bag and a terry cloth. When she managed to bite through the bag, ultimately stopping his efforts to suffocate her, he pulled out a knife he had hidden on him and began to violently attack her, and he later reported that he had cut her throat from ear to ear. Following this attack, he then returned to the trunk where he managed to lure out Anita by saying to her, "Look, there's this blood over me. Your friend freaked out on me. I hit her. I think I broke her nose, but I need your help. Can you come out and help me calm her down?" So she got out of the trunk thinking that she needed to go and help her friend because there had been an accident. But when she'd stepped out of the boot, she was then also stabbed by Edmund. She hadn't died initially. He still had placed her body in the trunk with the body of her friend, where she had ultimately died. These two bodies of the two young females remained in his boot while he drove back to his house, and then inside his apartment he undressed Mary Ann's body and beheaded Anita's, amongst doing a number of other things to the remains. He specifically held onto both of their beheaded heads for a while before disposing of them. He also dismembered parts of the bodies, I believe, to try and hide them, and in August of that same year, Mary Ann's head was found. The next attack came on September the 14th in the year of 1970. Kemper had spotted 15-year-old Aiko Ku, who had missed her bus to her dance class in the evening when he had offered her a ride, but when she realised that he wasn't taking her in the right direction, she began to panic. She, like his two previous victims, had been very brutally attacked. He'd taken her remains home and dissected her remains, carried out a number of different sexual acts on. Initially, not all of her remains were found, and at first investigators hadn't linked this attack with the set of attacks on the two previous female victims and the two students. They just kind of hadn't seen them as the same person as of yet. And then in the early months of 1973, Kemper struck again when 18-year-old Cindy Schul was travelling to her class when she disappeared. Someone initially had spotted her hitchhiking, getting a lift from someone, and then a few days later some dismembered limbs were discovered on a cliff, as well as a torso having washed ashore nearby, which was later then confirmed to have belonged to Cindy. It was around this time that the local media outlets began using words like the butcher to describe whoever it was that had been brutally attacking all of these young students, and the name the co-ed killer began to float around because of the fact that these students appeared to have been the target. And then on February the 5th, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu had been hitchhiking when the pair of them both disappeared. Edmund had picked up these two girls following a huge argument that he'd had with his mother, which just seemed to be the pattern. It seemed to be every time him and his mother had argued, he would then go out, pick up a hitchhiking student and brutally attack her, and this is exactly what had happened. What is worth noting is that at the time his mother had actually been working on campus at UC Santa Cruz, and this was important as because of all of the attacks that had been going on, all UC Santa Cruz students had been told, don't trust people that you don't know, that says like staff of UC Santa Cruz and they're trustworthy, so try and only hitchhike and only trust getting people's cars that maybe have that sticker. But Kemper did have that sticker because his mum worked on the campus. So obviously when he would offer these hitchhikers rides, they thought they could trust him because he had this staff sticker. So these two girls were inside his car and he began to give them a lift when he at some point stopped the car, told them to look at the beautiful view, and as the pair turned, he shot them both very suddenly inside his car. Just like his previous victims, he placed the bodies in the boot of his car. He then drove to a petrol station, then his mother's house, with the bodies still in the car, and just like the previous cases, he beheaded and molested the remains. He disposed of the body parts in a number of different areas as a means of attempting to hide as much of the remains as possible. Life for Edmund didn't really seem to change much following this, as he went back to his usual life living with his mother, who he still really didn't get on with. They still were constantly having arguments and these fantasies were still going on in his head. But then about a month after these last attacks, he decided it was time for him to kill his mother. She had spent the evening out with her friends, and so when she returned home she'd headed for her bed. In the early hours of the morning, Kemper had entered her bedroom, and he later told investigators that she just looked up at him while she was lying in bed and said, "I suppose you want to talk now," to which he replied that he didn't. His method of choice had been a claw hammer, and this is exactly what he had used to kill his mother. Following her death, he did a number of unspeakable things to her remains, including removing her head and sexually assaulting it. He placed her head on a mantle and began just screaming at her all these things that he thought about her and all these things that he'd never had the chance to say to her, as well as throwing darts at her head. Like, he did a lot of things to these remains. And it was at this point that he realised that people would know that he was the one to blame for his mother's death. And so he decided that there was only one person that would notice if she were to just kind of go missing, and this would be his mother's friend, Sally Hallett. So he decided that he would invite Sally Hallett over to the house under the pretense that he was going to take her and his mother out for a dinner. But when she arrived at the home, he welcomed her in, and then he punched her in the stomach and strangled her, killing her as well. He left her remains on the bed that he spent the entire night in, so he just spent the night with 2 sets of remains inside the house. The next morning he left his house and he began driving Sally's car, and he listened on the radio assuming that he would suddenly hear some sort of news report on these 2 bodies that were found of his mother and her friend, but there were none. And this kind of disappointed him. When he'd made it as far as Colorado, he'd become disappointed at the lack of news report and the lack of public attention that his crimes had gotten, and so he decided to head straight for a phone booth. He rang up the Santa Cruz Police Department and confessed that he had been the co-ed killer. Now, at first, the initial dispatcher had believed it was a prank call, so he had to actually ring up again and attempt to convince the police department that he was the man they were looking for. Finally, he was told that they would be sending officers out to his location, so that he was to stay on the phone with them so they could make sure that he was still there. And then when the officers arrived at this particular phone booth that he was stood in, they came face to face with this huge 6'9" Goliath of a man that was the co-ed killer. He was obviously then questioned in detail about each of the crimes just to make sure that they did actually have the right man, and he was able to relay in extreme detail, very, very articulated in his recollection of each of the events, but he gave a lot of detail on each of the individual crimes. And at that point, he was able to give details that the investigators themselves didn't know, because they were at a complete loss. Like, they had no idea that this man had been the man. They were not even close to being on him. During Kemper's trial, the defence team attempted to take an insanity plea to try and prove that he wasn't really guilty of his crimes because he was not mentally sound. However, this was obviously something that they couldn't actually prove because he was very mentally sound. If you ever watch clips, if you do watch this documentary, you'll see clips of him talking. He is very intelligent and he's very aware of what he's doing. And people always say, like, in these interviews and stuff that people have done with him, they say that he's a very likeable person, but he's also very honest. So he's a very, very interesting character. If you're interested in that sort of psychology of serial killers and psychopaths, it's very fascinating to watch. And the documentary itself, Kemper on Kemper, does a very, very good job at delving into that part of his case. So at the time, he just didn't really fit into any of the boxes that they had or criteria that they had to fit any of the mental health disorders or illnesses that they knew of at the time. And it was like he was just something entirely different, so they didn't really know how to approach his case. Ultimately, Edmund Kemper was sentenced to a life sentence on 8 counts of first-degree murder. He became such a huge influence on the development of behavioural science techniques that are used today. During his incarceration, he worked very closely with the FBI to build their understanding of offenders like himself, as well as some that aren't even anything like him, but he was very helpful in a lot of ways because he just shared things and he explained things. They went to him for advice on how they profiled certain people and the sort of person they were looking for, if they were looking for a certain serial killer. This documentary does a really good job at showing you how he helped the FBI, and I definitely think it's worth a watch because it is fascinating to think that the FBI built their techniques on profiling serial killers and catching psychopaths and things like that based on what a particular killer, Edmund Kemper, had told them. It's fascinating. So that is actually everything I'm going to go into detail with today because, like I said, I highly recommend you watch this documentary, Kemper on Kemper. Like I said, you can watch it on Now TV using the entertainment pass, which I'll leave linked down below, but it's definitely worth a watch because honestly, it's very, very, very well done. I honestly can't praise this one enough. It kept me very interested. I'd definitely love to hear your thoughts on it down below. Obviously there's a lot with this case. It's a very, very fascinating case and I can't go into too many of the details because a lot of the details are quite upsetting, but I'm sure you get the gist, and I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of Edmund Kemper before, because he is a hugely influential person, like I said, in relation to the development of different techniques that we use today and that have helped our understanding of different offenders. So let me know if you do watch the documentary. I'd definitely be fascinated to hear your guys' thoughts or what you thought of it, because I thought it was definitely very interesting. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave your case requests down below. Don't forget to check out all the Now TV links and information in the description box, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.